Welcome everyone. My name is Julie and I've been working on this exhibition with Léonard Pongo. And we are now in Foreign Agent in Ouchy, in Switzerland, where both Primordial Earth and the Uncanny are exhibited together for the first time in Switzerland. And to start this conversation, maybe we should explain briefly how we know each other. I'll be quite brief, but basically a year ago during lockdown in June, I founded a platform called the Photographic collective, which is designed to give more visibility to artists based in Africa, but without necessarily gallery representation. And I decided to work with a board of advisors to help me work on this platform and select artists who we thought should have more visibility, and that's how I met Léonard, who is on the board of the Photographic collective. And we decided to work together, thanks to Foreign Agent, on this exhibition here. So should we start by discussing how your approach more generally, and also how you decided to work on this specific subject matter and represent it the way you represent it?
Sure. Well, it's thanks for having us, and thank you, Olivier. Yeah, this is a first opportunity to actually show both bodies of work, Primordial Earth, that's displayed in this room where we're sitting, and the Uncanny. I think the Uncanny grew very organically. When I first started the project, I had a completely different outlook as to what I wanted to photograph and how. And with time and interaction and learning, clearly, the project went from a classical documentary project looking at the second democratic elections in the DRC to a very subjective look at life in the country and my personal experience of actually discovering, experiencing, learning how to live in the DRC and what life is like, which happened because I was lucky enough to be surrounded by my family, and because of this very long process of kind of letting go of trying to control and trying to keep agency on my own work. Which was really a process, a very a big learning step where my whole approach to photography was actually altered by my relationships, and relationships became a constitutive part of how I actually photograph. Mm-hmm. So I went from this documentary outlook to more experiential relational way of photographing that mixes snapshots with very subjective images, including a lot of blur and more confrontational elements, where I try to not be outside and apart from my photography, but where it's clear that the photography, I'm clearly a biased actor, and so are all the people who are taking me on board, who are clearly defining the content of the images, sometimes often more than I am myself.
Mm. And if we look at the Uncanny specifically first, and the portraits are displayed in the next room, was it like a collaborative process, and how were the portraits being taken, and how those images came to life?
I tend not to present the project as a collaborative project because it wasn't deliberate. I didn't come with the intention of working on a collaborative project that would happen according to a specific modus operandi. I was there, I was trying to say something about an experience of living in the DRC, and my family, close friends were very clear about the fact that not growing up in Kinshasa, in Ghana, in Lubumbashi, I couldn't make sense of things in the same way as they could, because they grew up there, or if they didn't grow up there, they lived for a large part of their life in these cities. And so it's it is. Also, sometimes I wouldn't say that it's collaborative because I'm really not in charge. So the way that the responsibility, I'm just making the photos in these situations, and people know why I'm there and what my intentions are. That much is clear. Their intentions are not always clear, and also the images are not necessarily the result of a process whereby one person sets things up in a certain way and I do. I would be actually photographing along the whole process of me interacting, of me being brought somewhere, of somebody else wanting to show me something, and I would never actually ask people to pose or to perform in a specific way, which doesn't make it necessarily less performative. It's still an interaction. I'm still making images in these contexts, but it makes it less directed, and for me that was something that was extremely important, that the direction is, it's a game, it's an interplay between people who are not subjects, they are actually living their life, and they're fine with having me around because they want me to actually be part of that life. And for me that was, and still is, a gift. It's somehow part of my life, but that I couldn't always access, and that they were generous enough to take me in.
What I find very interesting is that I think once you told me about the Uncanny specifically, and you mentioned the idea of having or creating a diary, and what you just said about trying to move away from a documentary approach for people who don't really know or picture what documentary is. Could you explain a little bit how this visual language kind of move away from classic documentary?
I'm not sure I'm going to define what documentary approach is because it's very wide. It can be, documentary photography is many different things, but one thing that's very clear for me is that there was confronted by my family at first as to what my value was in being there and working as a photographer in this environment in a Congolese context. This really pushed me to redefine, okay, how can I do that truthfully to who I am and what I'm experiencing? And that led me to work in a more diaristic way, as it can be called, actually to photograph what's happening to me and what I'm part of as it's happening, and to try and infuse the impact of what I'm going through into the images, which means that this whole process that was very intense for me has made it through to the images that not only show parts of other people's lives, but it also shows to a large extent how I'm receiving it or how I'm living through it, or how intense the experience is, how much I can't actually process it. That makes that creates also a sense of loss of reference points at times, of overwhelm at others, and I felt that way. I realized later, because I was just photographing and living, which was already enough, but that had created a kind of mosaic of experiences that went through many different emotions and many different environments also, and that showed different people that were willing to show me also themselves in different ways that I had not been crafting. I had just been going along with it and reacting or accepting it, which is what actually constituted the images. More than my willingness to go according to a specific plan. So in the end, it's very interesting for me that after, because I kept on following the elections and the whole process as well, and I never wanted to show these images because they're absolutely not representative of the experience and of what I think as not a narrative, but as stories. It's not representative of what I want to put forward. These images are.
And they are mostly more based on your experience. It's more like a translation of your experience.
To a large extent, yes, and sometimes it would be people telling me, now come along and look at these experiences or these ways of experiencing the environment of these places, which you have no clue about, which nobody never ever puts forward, or just, you know, now there's this happening and you're the family photographer, so you're going to come and photograph it. And sometimes a picture comes from that context too, which is not so much about my experience. Of course, I'm always a subjective entity, but it's more about something else that's happening regardless of where I stand. And that's also yet another way that things end up in the images that I'm not predicting, that I'm not controlling.
And the notion of the uncanny was added later on, or is it something you had in mind when you started photographing this project?
No, it came later. It always all comes later because I don't actually look at the images when I'm making them. But the experience, it's a keyword that I think summarizes very well the general experience and the general energy that comes off the series that lasted for several years, from 2011 to, I was photographing for it from 2011 to 2017, and then the editing process is long and laborious. It took a couple of 3 years, and now I'm working on a book, so I'm going through the whole selection of images again for a book that will be published by Ghost Books in the spring of next year.
Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too.
And Primordial Earth was created not at the same time, but it kind of overlapped, right? And it looks very different.
Yeah.
And how, I'm just thinking about, I'm just wondering how this first approach to color, but this different way of representing the space and focusing on landscape, more specifically, while Uncanny is slightly more focused on people and cities. Well, this is a very different environment, and I was wondering how this came to life as well.
Yeah, I think my experience of the landscape, of nature, of the rural areas it's been an incremental process. So in the beginning of the Uncanny, I did travel also through the RC to go from Kinshasa to the Kasai region to Kananga, which is 700 plus kilometers away, and we did that as a week-long trip. It was my first experience of the landscape, and these experiences have accumulated, but I never really knew how to process them. Also, I didn't quite grasp how I could use photography as a tool to actually make a statement about the landscape, about the non-city areas. I mean, the Uncanny is very urban. So it's something that's been there, that's been brewing for several years, and I wanted to connect, so that there's always this connection to the land and the importance that it has for me personally, and I think maybe in a Congolese collective unconscious, this idea of the land. I do a lot of experimentation, so I've been experimenting for several years about different photographic techniques that could also take me away from the more rational, mental, analytical truth depiction. And I wanted something that would be, and that came, slowly became more and more clearly. I wanted a way of connecting to tradition that would allow me to depict the landscape. So that became my actual source of inspiration, and tradition in the sense of the traditional crafts or classical Congolese art, the tales, stories that I grew up with, stories that added the whole symbolism, and some of the ideas that are included in these philosophies. So that slowly imbricated with what I was trying to do, picturing the landscape, and that directed me to actually start photographing specific forms. I was a lot more abstract. So looking for these forms in the natural environment, and then also it led me to places that had significance traditionally, or significance for me personally, or that I thought might be places that were depicted in the tradition, where I could find back these signs, symbols, or an environment that's connected to the stories.
And what I find quite fascinating with both of those projects is thinking about photography as a way of depicting or representing what people see or what you see in your environment, and what you're doing, which is, to me, seems interesting because you kind of move away from what the camera is supposed to be doing. Either in Uncanny, where it's more abstract, more lyrical, kind of confrontational, but sometimes quite abstract. You don't necessarily know what's actually happening in the frame. While here as well, in Primordial Earth, working with different filters, or you also kind of challenge the automatism of the camera and the mode of viewing, which I find very interesting. And I think this is something that connects the two projects together. Is that something that, am I right to think that, or is it completely no, it's completely wrong?
No, that's perfectly correct. We're in the context of the DRC. It's a country where photography came along with a certain way of viewing humanity, or the lack thereof, for certain groups of population. It came with the colonial mission. It came with what I call a pseudo-scientific vision of organizing people, of classifying and defining them. So there's a whole power game behind it. And for me, it's interesting to use the camera in a way that takes distance with these, this claim that photography has the ability to grasp the truth and to kind of solidify it to a single way it can be viewed. And that's why I looked at how to alter the image making process itself by indeed using physical filters in front of the lens, modifying the camera so that they can see more than the eyes can see. And these ideas came also from looking at tradition and looking at how some stories tell you that there's a lot more than meets the eye. There's not all reality is graspable with your eyes, and you have to be aware of more things being there than what you can see. So I wonder how I could translate this traditional idea into my image making process, and that required modifying the camera itself and using tools that could bring me in, basically put me in this way of thinking, also in the way that the images are created, and creates a lot of mistakes, a lot of randomness, which was very important for me to take even more distance and to end up with a kind of a raw matter images that are not so much about the photographic, but more about the science and the shapes that they contain, and trying from there to kind of reconstitute my whole my own dictionary, inspired by the tradition and its symbols, but that's made by this, through this effort of actually recreating symbols, new symbols in these environments. So that's clearly brought me adrift from traditional photography, and more it brings me also to try and reconsider how I can use traditional techniques such as weaving, how I can create objects more than images, and that's bringing me further and further from the idea of depicting, and also from the idea that this master-slave relationship between the image maker and the subject. It's more of it was the case in the Uncanny, it's the case even more so now. It's an interactive process. It's a multi-layered process. There are many different moments where the image is impacted by different things, and it's a game. It's an interplay. It's meshing together different influences, and I find that fascinating because it means that when you come to there's many processes in the image creation, and one of them is actually looking at what you've done in the first phase and working with that, and from there crafting an end object. And this comes from one specific type of mistakes that and I tried to correct it and to reverse it, and it wouldn't work, and then it took a while for me to accept that the mistake itself was the content. And that creates also images that are not that they're so altered in terms of process, but in the way that they've made, that they were made, they are so different and they are so unexpected that they create also a game with perception and the way that an audience can actually not necessarily recognize what they already have in their mind when they look at the images. That allows them to be also in a different space, maybe a more open space. And in that space, for me, it's interesting that all of this pseudo-narrative, or whatever you want to call it, all of this environment, it is inspired by certain traditions, by certain stories about this land. And I believe it's quite strong to actually put that forward as a valid way of reading this space. And this perception game allows maybe people to be in a space where they can receive, when they can interact with this environment on new basis and not just the basis of what they already know, which I find a very interesting game to play with an audience also.
Yeah, playing with the viewer's perceptions.
Yeah, definitely.
And I was just also wondering, I mean, you mentioned this a little bit, but how Primordial Earth is kind of evolving, moving away from the print, the photographic medium, into textiles, into object, into installation, into video as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that as well, and how you're playing with photography and transforming it into a completely different craft.
I think it comes from a willingness to interact on different bases, and this whole perception game really brings me to other places, but it also comes from a willingness to kind of leave photography and the photographic behind. Sorry for the collective.
It's fine.
I know you're open-minded, so. But yeah, to get different ways of connecting with an audience, also give people different ways to interact with the medium, but at a very basic level. It comes from looking at what's been made in the crafts and looking at how I can put myself in kind of a continuity in that lineage, and how I can also make these techniques mine. You know, the Kuba symbols are quite important to me, into they are shapes that I've, for my life, actually been coming back again and again and again, and that I grew up seeing a lot of, and that have inspired me quite a lot. And they are woven a lot. They're also sculpted. So for me, when I realized that I tend to reproduce some of the symbols in my work, I also wonder how I could, through the use of these traditional crafts and techniques, also re-alter the images that I've made, and kind of come to a language where they come from, but with new symbols, with also altered symbols, and where I can bring my kind of my own points, my own statements, and techniques that have pre-existed. So it's this way of trying to both fit into a tradition, but also of using its tropes and its standards to tell new things that I find very relevant. And again, it puts forward, oh yes, this traditionally Congolese way of looking at the world, it's valid today. It's got its own philosophy. It's got, as Suleiman Bashir Diagne said, you know, these elements contain a whole philosophy of understanding the self, each other, nature. And for me, it's incredibly compelling to look at the depth of these ways of thinking. They are philosophies, cosmogonies, and they are extremely valid for everyone, not just for Congolese people, at a time where we ask ourselves a lot of questions about the place that human beings as a species play. So it's very strong for me to also see the relevance of these ways of thinking.
And working with digital as well,
Yeah.
and tackling those traditional stories is quite interesting.
Looking at the tools I have and looking at how I can bring them into these ways of seeing.
I think I asked most of the questions that I had. I wonder if I forgot anything now. Is there anything that you'd like to mention in addition?
I think we're pretty good.
I think we're pretty good. All right.
Thank you very
My
much.
pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for joining us.
And thank you to our host, Olivier
Thank
Chow.
you.